So this lecture is about neural networks, some basic concepts of neural networks. So we'll have the neuron. The neuron, which is the node, it is the basic unit of a neural network, and it is inspired from biological neurons. It receives inputs, applies weights, and passes the result through an activation function. So it receives input, then applies the weights, and passes the result through an activation function. Now, what is activation function? Activation function is it is a mathematical function applied to the output. It is applied to the output of a neuron to introduce non-linearity. It is a mathematical function applied to the output of a neuron to introduce non-linearity. Common activation functions include sigmoid function, then ReLU, rectified linear unit, then tan H, leaky ReLU, and softmax. Now, what are weights? We just studied weights. So, these are parameters that determine the strength of the connection between the neurons. Okay. So during training, when the neural networks undergo training, these weights are adjusted to minimize the errors. Now, what is bias? Bias is an additional parameter. It is an additional parameter in a neuron. It is an additional parameter. So during training, these weights are adjusted to minimize the error. Now, what is bias? Bias is an additional parameter. It is another parameter in a neuron that helps it shifts the activation function. So it is shifting the activation function, and this allows for better fitting of the model. Better fitting of the model. Now, what is input layer? Input layer, it is the first layer of the neural network that receives the input. Okay. Then what is the hidden layer? Hidden layer, they are intermediate layers. They are intermediate layers between input and output layers. They are intermediate layers between input and output layers. The network can have multiple hidden layers. The network can have multiple hidden layers here, which are called deep networks. Where each neuron performs computations on the inputs. Now, what is the output layer? The output layer, it is the final layer that produces the output. Output means the classification level or the regression value based on the inputs. Now, what is feed forward? The process where data moves forward through the neural network from the unit input layer to the output layer. What is backpropagation? Backpropagation, it is a training algorithm used for adjusting the weights by calculating the gradient of the loss function with respect to the weights. So adjusting the weights by calculating the gradient of the loss function with respect to the weights, and using it to update these weights. So it's adjusting the weights. So gradient, how the loss function is changing with respect to the weights. Now, what is gradient descent? Gradient descent, it is an optimization algorithm used to minimize the loss function. It is an optimization algorithm used to minimize the loss function by iteratively adjusting the model's parameters. So it is minimizing the loss function by iteratively adjusting the model's parameters, that is the weights and biases, in the direction of the steepest descent of the error. In the direction of the steepest descent of the error, where the error is rapidly reducing. So it is an optimization algorithm used to minimize the loss function by iteratively adjusting the model's parameters, weights and biases, in the direction of the steepest descent of the error. So it is minimizing the loss. Learning rate. A hyperparameter, it is a hyperparameter that controls how much to adjust the weights, in response to the gradient during optimization. In response to the gradient during optimization. So it's a hyperparameter that controls how much to adjust the weights in response to the gradient during optimization. So how much to adjust the weights in response to the gradient during optimization. Now what is an epoch? An epoch, so one complete pass through the entire training dataset. So one complete pass through the entire training dataset. Now what is batch size? The number of training samples used in one iteration. Number of training samples used in one iteration of updating the weights. Used in one iteration of updating the weights. Number of training samples used in one iteration. Number of training samples used in one iteration of updating the weights. Now, what is forward pass? The process of computing the output of a neural network given an input. That is the forward pass. Now, what is loss function? Loss function is a function that measures how well the neural network predictions match the actual levels. So, common loss functions include mean square error, cross entropy loss, and mean absolute error. Now, what is the optimizer? The optimizer, these are algorithms or methods used to update the weights and biases based on the gradients. So stochastic descent, Adam optimizer, and RMS prop. Overfitting. When a neural network learns the training data too well, including noise and details, that don't generalize well, and they don't generalize well to new data. So that is called overfitting. Now, what is underfitting? Underfitting is when a neural network is too simple to capture the underlying pattern in the data, leading to poor performance on both training and test data. Regularization techniques used to prevent overfitting. These are used to prevent overfitting by adding constraints to the model. The techniques, they are called regularization, then L regulation reach, then dropout. So what is dropout? Dropout, it is a regulation technique where random neurons are ignored during each training iteration to prevent overfitting. Now, what is normalization? Normalization is scaling the input data to a standard range. Scaling the input data to a standard range, which helps improve network training. So there's batch normalization, layer normalization. So it is primarily about scaling in standard range. Now, what is the training set? The training set is the data set used to train the neural network. And what is the validation set? Validation set, it is a separate portion of the data used to tune hyperparameters and model and monitor the model's performance during training. And what is test set? Dataset used to evaluate the final model performance after training. Now, what is the vanishing gradient problem? It's a problem where gradients become too small, leading to very slow updates and poor learning. Common in deep networks with certain activation functions like sigmoid or tanh. Exploding gradient problem, a problem where the gradients become too large, causing unstable and excessively large updates to the weights. Now, what is recurrent neural network, RNN? It's a class of neural networks where connections between neurons form directed cycles. So, sequential data can be modeled. Then, what is long short term memory neural network? A special kind of RNN which can learn long term dependencies, and it is designed to overcome issues like vanishing gradient problem. Convolutional neural network, type of neural network primarily used for image data. CNNs used convolutional layers to automatically detect spatial hierarchies in images. So, what is pooling layer? Pooling layer, it is a layer often used in CNNs to reduce the spatial size of representation, thereby reducing the number of parameters and computation in the network. So, that is about all for this lecture. Thank you very much.